The DNA confirmation email landed in Detective Sarah Klein's inbox on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in November 2023. She stared at the screen for a long moment, the numbers burning into her memory. 61 years, 8 months, and 14 days. That's how long the state of Ohio had carried the weight of this unsolved murder. The statistical probability of the match was 1 in 920 septillion, an impossibility so vast that it dwarfed the total number of human beings who had ever walked the planet. And yet, the man responsible had been dead for 45 years. When he took the life of 10-year-old Emily Rose Harlan on a rainy April morning in 1962, he had lived less than 8 blocks away in the same sleepy mill town. From the second-floor window of his small rented house, he could look out across the river and see the hillside cemetery where she was laid to rest. His name had never once appeared in any of the thousands of pages of reports compiled over 6 decades. Not as a witness, not as a person of interest, nothing. So how did a 21-year-old graduate student with a second-hand laptop and an obsession with family trees finally expose a killer who had carried his secret to the grave and beyond? Welcome to Forgotten Files. I'm your host, and today we're stepping into one of the oldest cold cases ever cracked in the Midwest, a case that shook an entire community to its core, rewrote the rules of investigation, and delivered a truth both chilling and strangely comforting. Genetic evidence endures long after memories fade and suspects die. Before we begin this journey, if you believe that no child's murder should ever be forgotten, no matter how many decades pass, do me a favor and subscribe right now. This story is long, layered, and full of quiet heartbreak. You'll want to stay with it until the end. Hit the bell, settle in, and let's start at the beginning. It was Tuesday, April 17, 1962, in Riverton, Ohio, a fading steel town along the Ohio River, where the smokestacks still coughed gray into the sky, and most folks still left their doors unlocked. The rain had been falling since dawn, a cold spring drizzle that turned the streets glossy and the air thick with the smell of wet coal dust. 10-year-old Emily Rose Harlan woke up earlier than usual that morning. The next day was her first communion at St. Agnes Catholic Church, a milestone her family had been preparing for weeks. She had carefully chosen 2 jars from her mother's pantry, peaches and green beans, to bring as an offering for the nuns who taught her catechism class. Sister Margaret had mentioned the convent pantry was running low, and Emily wanted to help. She also hoped to slip into the church early for private prayer before school started. Emily was small for her age, barely 4'8", with pale freckles across her nose, hazel eyes, and auburn hair she kept in 2 neat braids. Her family described her as gentle, thoughtful, the sort of child who noticed when someone else was sad and tried quietly to fix it. She had recently started taking piano lessons on an old upright her father had bought secondhand and practiced every evening after supper. Emily was born on a snowy New Year's Eve in 1951 in nearby Youngstown. By 1962, the Harlan family had put down roots in Riverton. Her father, Thomas Harlan, worked double shifts at the mill to keep food on the table. Her mother, Grace, took in sewing to help make ends meet. Emily was the middle child among 5, older brother Michael, 16, older sister Kathleen, 14, Emily, younger brother Patrick, 8, and the baby, Teresa, just 4. That morning, for the first time, Emily asked if she could walk the 7 blocks to St. Agnes School alone. Normally, she went with Kathleen and Patrick, but she wanted to arrive early enough for prayer and to deliver her jars without rushing. Her parents hesitated, then agreed. The route was familiar, the town was safe, or so everyone believed, and she was growing up. Between 7:45 and 8 a.m., Emily pulled on her navy coat, plaid skirt, white blouse, and red rain boots. She tied a clear plastic rain scarf over her braids, grabbed her school satchel and the 2 jars wrapped in a paper bag, kissed her mother goodbye, and stepped out into the drizzle.
The rain kept most people indoors, but a few neighbors spotted her. Mrs. Dorothy Lang, hanging laundry under her back porch, saw Emily hurrying east along Maple Street, head down against the weather. Mr. Frank Costello, starting his delivery truck, noticed her crossing River Avenue near the railroad bridge. He thought about offering her a ride, but decided not to interfere. That was the last time anyone saw Emily Rose Harlan alive. By noon, alarm bells were ringing in the Harlan household. Emily had not arrived at school. Sister Margaret marked her absent in every morning class. When the children came home for lunch, a common practice back then, Kathleen and Patrick walked through the door, but Emily did not. Thomas Harlan told the older children to return to school and check again. Kathleen went straight to the principal's office. The answer was the same. No one had seen her. A cold dread settled over the family. Thomas began searching immediately. He checked the church, retraced the route she would have taken, knocked on doors up and down Maple and River Avenue. Around 2:30 p.m., a woman who lived near the old riverbank flagged him down. "You looking for a little girl in a navy coat?" she asked, voice trembling. Thomas nodded. "They found one," she whispered, "down by the old slag dump." 3 miles south of the Harlan home, on the outskirts of town, lay an abandoned industrial waste site, an ugly scar left by decades of steel production. The city had long used it as an unofficial landfill for everything from household trash to factory slag. It sat in a hollow near the river, hidden from the main road. At approximately 1:45 p.m., 2 teenagers skipping school had driven out to the dump in a borrowed car to smoke and drink stolen beer. As they tossed empty bottles into the pit, one of them spotted something unnatural among the rusted barrels and broken furniture about 30 feet down the slope. At first, he thought it was a mannequin. Then he saw the red boots. They raced to the nearest payphone and called the Riverton police.
Officers arrived quickly, along with Father Daniel from St. Agnes. He had been summoned because the body was clearly a child. When the priest looked down into the pit, his knees buckled. He recognized Emily immediately. "I need to warn you, the details of what they found are difficult, but they matter. Understanding the violence is important when we later meet the man responsible." Emily was discovered fully dressed in her school uniform and coat, lying at the base of the dump. Her red boots had been removed and placed neatly side by side a short distance away, along with her satchel and the paper bag containing the jars of peaches and green beans. Her wrists had been bound in front with strips torn from her own rain scarf. Her ankles were tied with her belt. A handkerchief, later determined to belong to the killer, had been forced so deep into her mouth that it caused visible trauma. She had suffered blunt force injuries to the head and signs of manual strangulation. The medical examiner, Dr. Walter Brennan, would later list cause of death as asphyxia due to ligature strangulation. But there was more. Emily had been sexually assaulted, and the perpetrator had left behind trace evidence, biological material on her clothing, that meant nothing in 1962, but would one day become the unbreakable thread connecting him to the crime. In 1962, DNA was still the stuff of university laboratories. The double helix structure had only been mapped 9 years earlier. No one imagined it could one day identify a single individual out of billions. So, the evidence was carefully collected, documented, and filed away. The case went into storage to wait for a future no one could yet see. Riverton, Ohio, in the spring of 1962, was a town built on steel and trust. Immigrants had arrived in waves, first the Irish and Germans, then Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, each group carving out neighborhoods, churches, and lives around the mill. The blast furnaces glowed orange at night, and the river carried the smell of sulfur and coal tar. People knew their neighbors' names, their children's names, and usually what they were having for dinner. Doors stayed unlocked. Kids roamed freely. Emily Harlan's murder shattered that.
The day after her body was found, the local newspaper ran a front-page photograph of her smiling in her first communion dress. The headline read simply, "Tragedy Strikes Riverton." Mayor Harold Grayson, who lived 4 blocks from the Harlans and whose daughter had been in Emily's catechism class, issued a brief statement. "A crime like this reminds us that evil can walk among us even in the safest places." Overnight, the town changed. Parents began walking their children to school. Doors were locked for the first time. Older siblings were told to keep younger ones in sight. The assumption of safety, that small-town innocence, vanished in a single rain-soaked morning. The funeral was held at St. Agnes on a gray April Saturday. The church overflowed. People stood in the aisles and spilled out onto the steps. When the small white coffin was closed, Grace Harlan bent down and kissed her daughter's forehead one last time. A mother should never have to do that. For the next 61 years, Grace and Thomas Harlan would carry 2 questions that never left them. Who did this to our Emily, and why? If you're still with me and you believe that families deserve answers even when decades have passed, hit that like button. It helps these stories reach more people who care about justice. Let's keep going. The Riverton Police Department and the Ohio State Bureau of Criminal Investigation, BCI, launched an immediate, exhaustive investigation. Detectives worked 16-hour days for months. They interviewed hundreds of residents along Emily's route, every man who had ever been in trouble with the law, every drifter who had passed through town. They compiled more than 3,800 pages of reports in the first year alone, a number that would eventually grow to over 5,500. They preserved every piece of physical evidence: Emily's clothing, the handkerchief, the torn scarf strips, the jars of peaches and green beans, both unbroken, even the red boots. That decision, to treat the case with the care of a future they couldn't yet imagine, would prove decisive decades later. But in 1962, forensic tools were primitive. Blood typing could narrow suspects to broad categories: A, B, AB, or O. Fingerprints had to be compared by hand. There was no national database, no computers, no way to search beyond the town limits effectively. Still, investigators chased every lead. A local man who had argued with Thomas Harlan over a late bill at the mill confessed to the murder during questioning. He claimed he had strangled Emily with his bare hands. Detectives knew the ligature marks didn't match. The confession was thrown out. Another man, a transient who had been seen near the dump the week before, disappeared the day after Emily's body was found. Police tracked him to Pittsburgh, but he had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. A third lead came from a woman who reported seeing a blue Ford sedan idling near the river bridge around 8:15 a.m. that morning. The driver was described as a white man in his late 20s or early 30s. The car was never identified. Investigators even looked at a possible connection to the unsolved 1959 murder of a 9-year-old girl in Steubenville, 30 miles upriver. The cases shared similarities: young female victim, sexual assault, and strangulation, but no concrete link emerged. Over the years, more than 180 detectives from local, state, and federal agencies would touch the case. They reviewed it annually. They stayed in regular contact with the Harlan family. Retired Detective Paul Whitaker, one of the original investigators, kept a small photo of Emily in his wallet until he died in 1998. His wife later said he mentioned her name every April. But the killer's name never surfaced, not once. Grace saved every sympathy card, every newspaper clipping, every letter of support. At every family gathering, Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, she ended grace with the same quiet prayer: "Please help the police find the person who took Emily." She forgave the man who did it, even without knowing his name. She said she had to, for her own peace. Thomas Harlan died in 1987. Grace followed in 2012, still without answers. The four surviving siblings, Michael, Kathleen, Patrick, and Teresa, grew up carrying the hole in their family. They married, had children, built lives, but Emily's absence was always there, a quiet ache at every milestone she never reached. In 2009, 47 years after the murder, the Ohio State Bureau of Criminal Investigation Crime Lab finally developed a partial DNA profile from the biological material left on Emily's coat. It was faint, degraded, but it was enough to exclude every suspect who had ever been considered in 1962. None of them matched. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database of Convicted Offenders and Arrestees. For more than a decade, every month, every year, it was checked against new entries. No hits. The reason was simple. The killer had died long before DNA databases existed. The case went cold again. But something else was quietly changing. In the late 2010s, forensic genetic genealogy began to make headlines. The Golden State Killer arrest in 2018 had shown the world what was possible, uploading crime scene DNA to public genealogy sites like GEDmatch, finding distant relatives, building family trees backward and forward until a suspect emerged. In early 2021, the Ohio BCI partnered with a small genetic genealogy firm based in Columbus. The goal was to create a forensic sketch of the unknown suspect using DNA phenotyping.
On June 15, 2021, authorities released composite images to the public. A man of European ancestry, dark brown hair, hazel or green eyes, fair complexion, shown at approximate ages 25, 40, and 65. The images were posted on the BCI website, shared on local news, and circulated through social media. No one recognized him, at least not immediately. Then, in September 2021, the firm uploaded the killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch. Within days, they found a distant match, roughly a fifth to sixth cousin relationship, about 68 centimorgans of shared DNA. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. That thread would soon be pulled by someone unexpected. Let me introduce you to the person who finally pulled that thread. Her name is Lauren Whitaker, no relation to the retired detective, just a coincidence that would later feel like fate. In the fall of 2021, Lauren was a 21-year-old graduate student in anthropology at Ohio University in Athens, about 2 hours southeast of Riverton. She had grown up in Columbus, but genealogy had been her passion since middle school. It started innocently enough. Her father's side of the family had a persistent rumor that they were distantly related to a Civil War general. At age 13, Lauren built her first family tree on a free website to prove or disprove it. She disproved it, but the process hooked her. By high school, she was helping classmates find lost grandparents. By college, she had assisted 3 different police departments in Ohio and Kentucky on unidentified remains cases, quietly, for free, just because she could. Lauren ran a small, low-key genealogy service from her campus apartment called Branch and Root Genealogy. One evening in October 2021, she was scrolling through unsolved cases on the Ohio BCI Cold Case website, looking for anything that might benefit from genetic genealogy. When she landed on Emily Rose Harlan's page, something stopped her cold. The newly released DNA phenotyping composites stared back at her. A man with sharp cheekbones, dark hair, hazel eyes. But it wasn't the face that gripped her, it was the story. A 10-year-old girl walking to her first communion practice, carrying jars of peaches and green beans for the nuns. Lauren read the details twice, then a third time. She closed her laptop, stared at the wall for a long minute, and made a decision. The next morning, she sent an email to Detective Sarah Klein, the current lead investigator on the Harlan case at the Ohio BCI. Subject:
Offer of pro bono genetic genealogy assistance, Emily Rose Harlan, 1962. Dear Detective Klein, my name is Lauren Whitaker. I'm a graduate student in anthropology with 10 years of experience in genetic genealogy. I've previously assisted law enforcement on several cold cases involving unidentified remains. I came across Emily Harlan's case on the BCI website and noticed the recent GEDmatch upload. If it would be helpful, I'd be honored to volunteer my time to build family trees from any available genetic matches. No cost, no obligation. I just want to help bring answers to her family. Thank you for considering. Lauren Whitaker. Most detectives would have deleted it. A grad student offering to solve a 60-year-old murder? But Sarah Klein had been on the case for 8 years. She had read every file, visited the slag dump, sat with the Harlan siblings. She knew traditional methods had run dry. She looked up Lauren's name, found articles about the earlier cases she had helped with, saw the quiet professionalism of her website. Then she forwarded the email to her supervisor with a single line. This might be worth a conversation. 2 weeks later, Lauren was officially brought on board. She signed non-disclosure agreements, was given secure access to the partial case file, the DNA upload data from GEDmatch, and the list of existing genetic matches. Her starting point, that single 5th to 6th cousin match, 68 centimorgans, and a handful of more distant connections. To give you an idea of the scale, imagine trying to find one specific person in a city of 2 million using only the clue that they share a great-great-great-grandparent with someone else in the city. That was Lauren's task. She worked nights and weekends around her coursework. She built trees backward from the matches, identifying common ancestral couples in the 1800s, mostly German and Irish immigrants who had settled in the Ohio River Valley. Then she worked forward, branch by branch, generation by generation, tracking every male descendant who could possibly carry the Y chromosome line that matched the crime scene profile. By spring 2022, one surname cluster began to stand out: Keller. Investigators recognized it immediately. In 1978, a woman named Ruth Keller was found strangled in a wooded area outside Wheeling, West Virginia, less than 50 miles from Riverton. The case remained unsolved, but old notes mentioned possible links to the Ohio Valley. When BCI ran a Y chromosome comparison, it aligned with the Harlan suspect profile. They were on the right ancestral path. Lauren kept building. She asked and got voluntary DNA samples from living Keller descendants. Each new sample helped her triangulate closer. The shared DNA amounts slowly climbed. 68 centimorgans became 120, then 340, then over 900, pointing toward a second or third cousin relationship. By late 2022, the Ohio BCI lab had also developed a strong YSTR profile from the evidence. It confirmed the paternal line they were chasing. Through painstaking cross-referencing of census records, draft cards, city directories, and newspaper obituaries, Lauren narrowed the suspect pool to 5 men. 4 were still living and quickly eliminated with voluntary swabs. The 5th had died decades earlier. His name was Victor Raymond Keller. Victor Keller was born March 14, 1935, in Riverton, Ohio, the same town where Emily Rose Harlan would be born 16 years later. He graduated from Riverton High in 1953, where his yearbook described him as quiet, good-looking, fond of cars and baseball. After graduation, he worked odd jobs: gas station attendant, delivery driver, short-order cook. He served 2 years in the Army from 1955 to 1957, stationed mostly in Germany, then returned to Riverton.
He never married, had no children that anyone knew of, and lived a solitary life in a series of rented rooms. In 1962, at age 27, he resided at 412 Elm Street, a small second-floor apartment less than 8 blocks from the Harlan home on Maple Street. From his back window on a clear day, he could see the hillside cemetery where Emily would later be buried. Old neighbors remembered him as polite but distant. He kept to himself, rarely socialized, and was often seen walking alone along the river at odd hours. His name had never appeared in any of the original 1962 investigation files, not once. He had no criminal record at the time, no reason to be on anyone's radar. But there was something else that made investigators' stomachs turn. In July 1969, 7 years after Emily's murder, Victor Keller was arrested for the brutal assault of a 19-year-old waitress in a parking lot behind a Riverton diner. She had finished her late shift and was walking to her car when he attacked her, attempted sexual assault, and beat her severely. A passing motorist interrupted the attack. Keller fled. He was arrested 2 days later after the victim picked him out of a lineup. Police recovered fibers from his car that matched her torn uniform. He pleaded guilty to felonious assault to avoid the more serious charges. In October 1969, he was sentenced to 2 years probation and mandatory psychiatric counseling. No prison time. The similarities to Emily's case were unmistakable. Sexual motivation, extreme violence, use of a secluded location, attempt to silence the victim. But in 1969, no one connected the assault back to the 1962 murder. DNA testing didn't exist. The Harlan case files never mentioned Keller, and the assault file never referenced Harlan. Victor Keller lived quietly after that. He moved a few times within the county, worked as a night janitor at the mill, kept out of trouble, or at least out of arrests. On September 22, 1978, at age 43, he was found dead in his small apartment on River Street. Cause of death, acute myocardial infarction. Natural causes. He was buried in the same hillside cemetery he could once see from his window, just a few hundred yards from Emily's grave. He died believing no one would ever know. But the evidence had waited patiently. By the summer of 2023, Detective Sarah Kine and the Ohio BCI team knew they were closing in. Lauren Whitaker's genealogy work had pinpointed Victor Raymond Keller with near certainty. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The proximity to the Harlan home, the view of the cemetery, the chilling similarities to the 1969 assault, the matching Y chromosome line. But for absolute proof, for the kind of closure that could be announced to the world, they needed one more thing: a direct DNA comparison. Victor Keller had been in the ground for 45 years. In August 2023, after consultations with the county prosecutor's office and the Harlan family, the BCI applied for a search warrant to exhume Keller's remains from Riverton Hillside Cemetery. The request was granted quietly. On a cool morning in early October 2023, under the supervision of the county coroner and with cemetery officials present, the grave was opened. A small bone sample was taken, enough for modern forensic testing, but handled with respect. The process was dignified, almost solemn. Detective Kline later said, "We weren't digging up a monster. We were finally giving Emily the voice she'd been denied for 60 decades. The sample was rushed to the BCI crime lab in London, Ohio. Technicians extracted nuclear DNA and compared it to the profile developed from the evidence on Emily's coat all those years ago. The results arrived on Tuesday, November 14, 2023. Detective Sarah Kline was alone in her office when the email came through. She opened the attachment with steady hands. She had waited too long to tremble now. The match probability, 1 in 920 septillion. The YSTR profile, identical.
After 61 years, 8 months, and 14 days, they had him. Victor Raymond Keller was the man who abducted, assaulted, and murdered 10-year-old Emily Rose Harlan on that rainy April morning in 1962. He lived 8 blocks away. He watched her grave from his window. He died peacefully in his sleep, thinking the rain had washed away his secret forever. But science doesn't forget. On Thursday, November 30th, 2023, the Ohio BCI held a press conference in the community room of the Riverton Public Library, the same building where Emily had once checked out books on piano music and saints' lives. The room was packed. Harlan family members filled the front rows. Reporters, retired investigators, town officials, and residents who had lived with the shadow of this case for generations stood shoulder to shoulder. Present were Detective Sarah Klein, lead investigator, Special Agent Mark Ellison, BCI supervisor, Lauren Whitaker, now 23 and finishing her master's thesis, retired detectives who had worked the case in the 1980s and 1990s, and the 4 surviving Harlan siblings, Michael, Kathleen, Patrick, and Teresa, all now in their 60s and 70s. Their parents were gone. Grace and Thomas Harlan had died without ever hearing the name Victor Keller. Sarah Klein stepped to the podium first. This is a significant day for the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, for the Riverton community, and most importantly, for the Harlan family, she began. Her voice was calm, but it caught when she continued. Emily Rose Harlan was a gentle, faithful little girl who wanted nothing more than to prepare for her first communion and help the sisters at her school. On April 17, 1962, that innocence was stolen from her in an act of unimaginable violence. She paused, swallowing hard. We have identified her killer as Victor Raymond Keller, a Riverton resident who died in 1978. Using advanced forensic genealogy, we obtained a DNA match that is statistically certain beyond any reasonable doubt. Klein's composure cracked. She looked directly at the Harlan siblings. I wish we could have brought this news to you sooner. I wish your parents could have been here to hear it. But I hope you know that no one ever forgot Emily. This case has been actively worked for 60 decades, and today, because of persistence, science, and the extraordinary work of a young genealogist, we can finally say we know who did this. She introduced Lauren Whitaker. Lauren, visibly emotional, spoke quietly. This was the most challenging and meaningful project I've ever worked on. I spent almost 2 years building trees, chasing leads, losing sleep over dead ends. But every time I thought about Emily, about those jars of peaches and green beans still waiting to be delivered, I kept going. I'm just grateful I could play a small part in giving her family answers. Then the Harlan siblings spoke. Kathleen Harlan, Harlan Whitby, Emily's older sister, stood first.
We have carried Emily with us every day of our lives, she said. At every birthday, every wedding, every birth of a grandchild, there was always an empty chair. Our mother prayed for this day until the day she died. She wanted justice, not revenge. She wanted Emily's story to matter. Kathleen's voice broke. Today, justice has been served. The man who hurt our sister has a name, and Emily finally has the truth told about what happened to her. Thank you to every detective who never gave up. Thank you to Lauren, who worked for nothing but the hope of helping strangers. And thank you to Emily, for being the sweet, bright light you were, even for just 10 short years. Michael Harlan, the oldest brother, added, I was 16 when it happened. I remember searching the streets that day, calling her name until my voice gave out. For 61 years we wondered. Now we know. It doesn't bring her back, but it lifts a weight I didn't realize I was still carrying. Patrick spoke briefly. The police stayed in touch our whole lives. Every few months, someone would call or visit just to say they were still working. That meant everything. Teresa, the youngest, who had never known her sister outside of photographs and stories, ended with, "I grew up hearing about Emily, the girl who loved piano, who wanted to help the nuns, who braided her hair so carefully. Today, I feel like I finally met the rest of her story. And I can tell my own children the truth always comes, even if it takes a lifetime." No one in the room was dry-eyed. After the press conference, local resident Margaret Dorsey, now 78, who had been a classmate of Victor Keller's in high school, told a reporter, "He was always quiet, kept to himself. You never would have thought. I'm glad it's over. Riverton can breathe again." The Emily Rose Harlan case became one of the oldest in the Midwest to be solved through forensic genetic genealogy. It joined a growing list of impossibilities made possible. Decades-old murders, unidentified remains, predators who believed time had erased their crimes. But more than statistics, it was a reminder of something deeper. Evidence preserved with care in 1962, when no one knew why, became the key in 2023. A young woman in a college apartment working for free for 2 years unraveled a secret buried with a man 45 years earlier. And a family that had waited through 3 generations of investigators finally heard the name they had both dreaded and needed to know. The identification of Victor Raymond Keller didn't just close a file, it closed a chapter that Riverton, Ohio had been living in for over 60 years. In the weeks after the November 2023 press conference, something quiet but profound happened in the town. People who had grown up hearing whispers about the little girl at the slag dump finally had a full story. Parents who had used Emily's case for decades to warn their children about strangers could now add an ending. The truth came out. The man was found. Justice, delayed but not denied, had arrived. The case quickly became part of a much larger conversation about how we solve the unsolvable. Since the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018, forensic genetic genealogy has transformed cold case investigation. What was once a niche technique has now helped solve more than 800 cases across the United States, murders, sexual assaults, and unidentified remains dating back to the 1940s. Some of the oldest include the 1956 murder of 2 young girls in Montana, solved 2023, the 1967 strangling of a teenager in Vermont, solved 2022, and now Emily Rose Harlan, among the longest-standing child homicide cases ever cracked with this method in the Midwest. How does it actually work? Traditional forensic DNA looks at about 20 specific markers, enough to match a profile if the person is already in CODIS, the national database of offenders and arrestees. But if the killer died before databases existed or never committed another crime that put him in the system, CODIS is useless. Genetic genealogy is different. When people take consumer tests like Ancestry or 23andMe, those companies analyze hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of markers across the entire genome. Many users then upload their raw data to public sites like GED Match so relatives can find them. Investigators, with proper warrants and adhering to site policies, can upload crime scene DNA to those public databases. They don't look for exact matches. They look for partial ones, third cousins, fifth cousins, sixth cousins, anyone sharing enough DNA to point to a common ancestor. Then a genealogist, like Lauren Whitaker, builds trees backward to that ancestor and forward through every branch, eliminating lines that don't fit the Y chromosome for male perpetrators, geographic clues, or age range. Eventually, the tree narrows to a handful of candidates. Police investigate traditionally,
alibis, records, living relatives, and confirm with direct DNA when possible. It's revolutionary, but it's also controversial. Critics argue it turns millions of innocent people's voluntarily uploaded DNA into a de facto law enforcement database without their explicit consent. Your choice to find second cousins could one day help identify a distant relative who committed a crime. Privacy advocates say it needs stricter oversight, warrants, or limits to violent crimes only. Supporters counter that the databases are public by choice and the technology overwhelmingly targets the guilty while bringing closure to victims' families. Most agree it should be restricted to serious offenses, murder, sexual assault, and unidentified remains, not minor crimes. Guidelines are evolving. Some states now require judicial approval before uploads. But one thing is undeniable. For families who have waited decades, this tool is a miracle. Emily's case is a perfect example. Without genetic genealogy, Victor Keller's name would never have surfaced. He was invisible to the original investigation. No witnesses, no prior record in 1962, no connection to the Harlans. He lived, worked, and died in the same small town, carrying his secret undisturbed. After the announcement, investigators quietly reopened files on other unsolved cases in the Ohio Valley between 1962 and 1978. They asked the public for information about Victor Keller, any unusual encounters, any suspicions from that era. A few people came forward. One woman, now in her 70s, contacted Detective Klein anonymously. In the summer of 1965, when she was 11, a man matching Keller's description had offered her and a friend a ride home from the public pool. They declined and ran. She had never thought much of it until she saw his photo in 2023. It unsettled me all over again, she said. Another tip came from a former co-worker at the mill. Keller sometimes worked the night shift alone in the maintenance building. On a few occasions in the early 1970s, teenage girls reported seeing a man watching them from the shadows near the river walking path. Nothing was ever proven, but the reports were logged. Investigators have not linked Keller definitively to any other crime, but they haven't ruled it out. If you have information, even something small, from that time period in the Riverton area, the Ojai BCI still wants to hear it. The tip line is open. What Emily's case really teaches us is this: preserve evidence even when you don't know why. The detectives in 1962 carefully stored clothing, fibers, and biological traces they couldn't test. They documented everything. That diligence mattered 61 years later. Never stop reviewing cold cases. The Ojai BCI, like many agencies, revisited Emily's file annually. They stayed in touch with the family. That persistence kept the flame alive. And never underestimate the power of one determined person. Lauren Whitaker was a graduate student working from her apartment, unpaid, for 2 years. She chased dead ends, rebuilt broken branches, asked for more samples when matches were weak. One young woman with a laptop and a sense of purpose unraveled a secret buried with a man in 1978. At the press conference, Detective Sarah Klein said something that has stayed with me. We tell investigators not to get emotionally attached to cases, but how can you not? Emily was 10 years old. She was excited about her first communion. She wanted to help the nuns. She braided her hair so carefully, and someone took all of that away. You carry that. Then she added, this should give hope to every family still waiting. No matter how much time passes, we don't forget. Science advances. Methods improve. People like Lauren step up. The truth has a way of finding daylight. The heroes of this story